Ben Carter had worked cattle ranches across Texas for 15 years, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of his wife lying pale and still in their bed. The midwife, Mrs. O'Malley, shook her head sadly as she cleaned her hands in the basin. "I'm sorry, Ben. We lost her. The bleeding just wouldn't stop." In the wooden cradle beside the bed, a tiny baby boy cried with surprising strength for someone who'd just entered the world. Ben stared at the child, his mind unable to process what had just happened. An hour ago, he'd been pacing outside their small cabin, listening to Martha's labored breathing and the midwife's encouraging words. Now Martha was gone, and he was alone with a baby he didn't know how to care for. Martha Carter had been the light of Ben's life for 3 years. They'd met at a church social in San Antonio, where she was visiting her cousin. Martha worked as a seamstress, creating beautiful dresses for the wealthy ladies of the city. Ben had been immediately struck by her gentle manner and the way she listened carefully to everything he said, as if his words actually mattered to someone. Their courtship had been proper but passionate. Ben would ride into town every Sunday, after church, bringing Martha wildflowers from the range and sitting with her on her cousin's front porch until the sun went down. Martha would tell him about the books she read and the dreams she had of making a real home somewhere, while Ben shared stories of ranch life and his plans to own land of his own someday, when they married. Ben bought a small piece of land outside Austin with money he'd saved from years of cowboy wages. The cabin he built was simple but sturdy, with 2 rooms and a stone fireplace that kept them warm through the winter months. Martha made it beautiful with curtains she sewed from fabric, scraps, and furniture she painted in cheerful colors. They'd been trying for a baby since their wedding night, and when Martha finally told him she was expecting, Ben felt like the richest man in Texas. He worked extra jobs to save money for the baby's needs, building a cradle from oak wood and sanding it smooth as silk. Martha spent her evenings knitting tiny clothes and humming lullabies she remembered from her own childhood. The pregnancy had been difficult from the start. Martha was sick for months, barely able to keep food down. As her time grew near, she became weak and tired, but she always smiled when Ben worried out loud. "Women have been having babies forever," she would say, patting her swollen belly. "Our little one will be just fine." Now Ben stood in their bedroom, looking at the results of their love and loss. The baby had stopped crying and was making small sounds, his tiny fists waving in the air. Mrs. O'Malley had wrapped him in one of Martha's soft blankets, but Ben was afraid to touch him. What did he know about babies? He was a cowboy, used to dealing with cattle and horses, not helpless infants. "He needs to eat soon," Mrs. O'Malley said gently. "I can stay tonight and help you get started, but after that, you'll need to find a wet nurse. The Hendersons have a new baby, and Mrs. Henderson might be able to help for a while." Ben nodded, though he wasn't really listening. He was thinking about all the things Martha had planned to teach their child. She'd talked about reading stories, teaching proper manners, making sure the baby grew up knowing right from wrong. How could he do any of that? He could barely read himself, having left school at 12 to work on his family's failing farm. Neighbors began arriving as word spread through the small community. Mrs. Patterson brought soup and bread. The Hendersons came with offers of help and condolences. Old Mr. Rodriguez, who owned the general store, promised to send whatever supplies the baby might need. Everyone meant well, but Ben felt overwhelmed by their kindness and his own helplessness. That first night was the longest of Ben's life. Mrs. O'Malley showed him how to prepare formula from cow's milk and honey, how to hold the baby while feeding him, how to change the cloth diapers Martha had prepared. The baby cried often, and Ben walked the floor for hours, trying to soothe him while fighting back his own tears. By morning, Mrs. O'Malley had to leave to attend to her own family. She'd arranged for Mrs. Henderson to come by twice a day to nurse the baby, but the rest of the time, Ben was on his own. He sat in the rocking chair Martha had insisted they buy, holding his son and trying to figure out how to be a father without a wife. The baby was beautiful, with Martha's delicate features and what looked like it might be Ben's dark hair. His eyes were the deep blue that all newborns seem to have, but Ben wondered if they'd turn brown like his own or stay blue like Martha's. He'd wanted to name the boy after his own father, but Martha had preferred the name David, after the psalm she loved. Now Ben whispered both names to the baby, unsure of everything. Friends and neighbors continued to help, but Ben could see the worry in their eyes. A single man trying to raise an infant on a remote ranch was almost unheard of. Most people expected him to give the baby to a family in town who could provide proper care. Some even suggested the orphanage in Austin, though they didn't say it directly to his face. As the sun set on his first day as a widowed father, Ben sat by Martha's grave in the small cemetery behind their house. He'd buried her that afternoon. With the help of neighbors who'd known and loved her, baby slept in his arms, peaceful for the moment, while Ben tried to find words for the prayer he wanted to say. "I don't know how to do this, Martha," he whispered to the simple wooden cross he'd carved with her name. "I don't know how to raise our boy without you, but I promise I'll try. I'll do whatever it takes to keep him safe and make you proud." Baby stirred in his arms, making the soft sounds that were already becoming familiar. Ben looked down at his son and saw Martha's gentle spirit reflected in the tiny face. Whatever challenges lay ahead, this child was all he had left of the woman he'd loved more than life itself. The first month of fatherhood nearly broke Ben Carter completely. Baby David cried at all hours, sometimes for reasons Ben could understand like hunger or wet diapers, but often for no reason he could figure out. The boy seemed to sense his father's inexperience and responded with endless fussing that left Ben exhausted and desperate. Mrs. Henderson came twice daily to nurse the baby, but her own infant kept her busy, and Ben could see the strain in her face. She had dark circles under her eyes and moved slowly, clearly struggling to care for two babies. Her husband Tom pulled Ben aside one morning with uncomfortable news. "Ben, I hate to say this, but Mary can't keep this up much longer. She's wearing herself thin trying to feed both babies, and our little Sarah isn't getting enough milk. We need to find another solution soon." Ben's heart sank. He'd been dreading this conversation, knowing it was coming, but hoping somehow it wouldn't. Without Mrs. Henderson's help, he had no way to feed David. The cow's milk formula made the baby sick, and there wasn't another nursing mother for miles around their isolated ranch. Sleep became a distant memory. Ben would doze in the rocking chair with David in his arms, jerking awake every time the baby made a sound. He tried laying the child in the beautiful cradle he'd built, but David seemed to prefer being held. Ben's back ached constantly from carrying the baby around their small cabin. His hands grew rough from washing endless diapers. The ranch work suffered terribly. Ben had only 6 cattle of his own, but even that small herd needed daily attention. Fences needed mending, water, troughs needed cleaning, and the vegetable garden Martha had planted was dying from neglect. Ben would strap David to his chest in a sling Mrs. O'Malley had shown him how to make. But the baby's crying spooked the cattle and made any real work impossible. Neighbors continued to help when they could, but everyone had their own responsibilities. Mrs. Patterson brought meals regularly, but she was caring for her elderly mother and couldn't do more. Mr. Rodriguez extended credit at his store, but he couldn't solve the fundamental problem of a man trying to do a woman's job in caring for an infant. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday morning when David had been crying for 3 straight hours. Ben had tried everything he could think of: feeding, changing, rocking, walking, singing the few lullabies he remembered from his own childhood. Nothing worked. The baby's face was red from crying, and Ben felt his own composure cracking. "Please, son," Ben begged, bouncing David gently while pacing the cabin floor. "Please tell me what you need. I'm trying my best here, but I don't know what to do." The baby's crying seemed to get louder, and Ben felt tears starting in his own eyes. He was failing Martha, failing their son, failing at the most important job he'd ever been given. Maybe the neighbors were right. Maybe David would be better off with a real family who knew how to care for children. Ben sank into Martha's rocking chair, still holding the crying baby, and let his own tears fall. "I'm sorry, Martha," he whispered. "I'm sorry I can't be the father he needs. I'm sorry I can't do this without you." That afternoon, Tom Henderson arrived with news Ben had been dreading. "Ben, we found a family in Austin who might take the baby. The Millers have been trying to have children for years, and they're good church people with money to provide properly for him. They could give him things you can't: education, opportunities, a mother's care." Ben looked down at David, who was finally sleeping after his morning of crying. The baby looked peaceful, his tiny chest rising and falling steadily. He had Martha's delicate nose and what Ben was increasingly sure were his own stubborn eyebrows. "How long do I have to decide?" Ben asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're coming to meet him next week." "You don't have to decide today, but Ben." Tom paused, choosing his words carefully. "You've got to think about what's best for the boy. Love isn't always enough." That evening, Ben sat by Martha's grave again, David sleeping against his chest. The baby had gained weight since birth and was getting stronger, but Ben felt weaker every day. The constant worry, lack of sleep, and stress of trying to manage. Everything alone was wearing him down to nothing. "I think I'm going to lose him, Martha," Ben said to the wooden cross. "Maybe it's for the best. Maybe he deserves parents who know what they're doing, who can give him all the things we plan to give him together." The next few days passed in a haze of difficult decisions and painful preparations. Ben found himself memorizing every detail. Of David's face, the way he curled his tiny fist around Ben's finger, the soft sounds he made while sleeping. If he was going to give up his son, he wanted to remember everything about these precious weeks they'd had together. Mrs. Patterson brought more food and stayed to help with David while Ben tried to catch up on ranch work. She watched him with sad eyes, understanding the impossible choice he was facing. "You're a good father, Ben," she said quietly while folding tiny clothes. "Don't let anyone tell you different. This situation isn't your fault." But Ben blamed himself for everything. He should have saved more money before the baby came. Should have moved to town where there were more people to help. He should have been stronger, smarter, better prepared for the possibility that Martha might not survive childbirth. On Sunday, Ben took David to church for the first time since Martha's funeral. The baby was quiet during the service, seeming to enjoy the music and voices around him. Afterwards, people gathered around to admire him and offer their condolences and support to Ben. "He's got Martha's sweet nature," Mrs. O'Malley observed, gently touching David's cheek. "And you're determined." Chin Ben Carter. "This boy's going to be special wherever he ends up." The words hit Ben like a punch to the gut, wherever he ends up. As if it was already decided that David wouldn't be staying with his father. Ben clutched the baby closer and walked quickly to his wagon, desperate to get home before anyone could. See him break down again that night, alone in the cabin with David sleeping in his arms. Ben made a decision that surprised even himself. He wasn't going to give up without a fight. There had to be another way, some solution he hadn't thought of yet. David was his son, Martha's son, and Ben owed it to both of them to exhaust every possibility. Before surrendering to what seemed like the inevitable, tomorrow he would ride to town and see if anyone had ideas he hadn't considered. Someone, somewhere, might have an answer that could keep his family together. It was a slim hope, but it was all Ben had left. Ben Carter rode into Austin with David strapped to his chest, determined to find some solution that would let him keep his son. The town was busy with Saturday morning commerce, and several people stopped to admire the baby and offer condolences. For Martha's passing, Ben accepted their sympathy politely, but his mind was focused on his mission. His first stop was Dr. Williams' office, hoping the older man might know of another nursing mother or have suggestions for feeding David without making him sick. The doctor examined the baby thoroughly and pronounced him healthy and well cared for, which gave Ben some confidence in his fathering abilities. "The boy's thriving, Ben," Dr. Williams said, bouncing David gently on his knee. "You're doing better than you think. As for feeding, we might try goat's milk instead of cow's milk. Some babies tolerate it better. Mrs. Garcia has goats, and she might be willing to help." Ben's spirits lifted slightly. Goat's milk was something he hadn't considered, and Mrs. Garcia was known for her kind heart. She'd lost her own husband the previous year and understood the challenges of managing alone. When Ben arrived at her small house on the edge of town, she welcomed him warmly. "Of course I'll help," Mrs. Garcia said in her heavily accented English, immediately reaching for David. "This little one needs all the help he can get. I have plenty of milk, and my goats are gentle. You can come twice a day, or I can send my boy Pedro with fresh milk to your ranch." For the first time in weeks, Ben felt a spark of hope. Mrs. Garcia showed him how to prepare the goat's milk properly, mixing it with a little water and honey to make it more digestible. David took to it immediately, drinking eagerly without the stomach upset that cow's milk had caused, but feeding was only one of Ben's problems. The baby still needed constant care, and Ben couldn't manage the ranch work while carrying David everywhere. He needed help during the day. Someone who could watch the baby while Ben worked with the cattle and maintained their property at the general store. Ben ran into Maria Santos, a young Mexican woman who sometimes worked as a house cleaner for wealthy families in town. Her English was limited, but she was known for her skill with children. When Ben explained his situation in his broken Spanish, her eyes filled with sympathy. "I help you," Maria said firmly. "My own baby. He died 2 years ago. I miss caring for little ones. Pay me what you can, and I come to your ranch during the day." Ben could hardly believe his luck. Maria was exactly what he needed, experienced with babies, available during the day, and willing to work for whatever he could afford. She could come out to the ranch each morning and help with David while Ben worked, then return to town in the evening. The arrangement started the following Monday. Maria arrived at sunrise, riding a gentle mare and carrying a bag of supplies. She took one look at the cluttered cabin and immediately began organizing everything with efficient competence. Within an hour, she had David fed, cleaned, and sleeping peacefully while she tidied the house and prepared food for Ben. "You good, Papa?" Maria told Ben, as they watched David sleep in his cradle. "But you need woman's help. Baby needs both Mama and Papa, but Papa alone can work if he has help." With Maria's assistance, Ben's life began to stabilize. She arrived each morning before dawn and stayed until evening, caring for David with the skill and tenderness of an experienced mother. The baby responded to her gentle touch and seemed to enjoy her soft Spanish lullabies. Ben could finally get a full day's work done, knowing his son was in capable hands. The ranch began to recover. 2. Ben repaired fences, tended to his small herd, and even managed to plant a lake garden. In the evenings, after Maria returned to town, Ben would take over David's care, feeding him the goat's milk and rocking him to sleep while telling stories about his mother. Mrs. Henderson was relieved to stop nursing David, and her own baby began to thrive with his mother's full attention. The community seemed pleased that Ben had found a way to keep his family together, though some still worried about the long-term challenges of raising a child alone. Ben's confidence as a father grew daily. He learned to interpret David's different cries, to anticipate his needs, and to soothe him when nothing else worked. The baby was developing his own personality, smiling more often and showing interest in the world around him. He particularly enjoyed being outside, watching the clouds, and listening to the cattle. One evening, as Ben sat on his front porch with David in his arms, Tom Henderson stopped by with news. "The Miller family from Austin came by today looking for you. They heard you decided to keep the baby and wanted to see if you'd changed your mind. I told them you seem to have things figured out now." Ben's stomach tightened. He'd forgotten about the Millers and the relief of finding help with David. What did they say? They were disappointed. They understood. Mrs. Miller said if you ever need anything for the boy, clothes, medicine, schooling when he's older, to let them know. They've got means to help and no children to spend it on. That night, Ben wrote a letter to Martha's sister in Kansas, telling her about David's birth and Martha's death. He included a small drawing that Maria had made of the baby and promised to send regular updates. Martha's family deserved to know about their nephew. David deserved to know his mother's relatives. The weeks turned into months, and Ben's new routine became natural. David grew stronger and more alert, fascinated by everything around him. He loved riding with Ben to check on the cattle, secure in a special carrier Maria had sewn for him. The baby's presence made even routine ranch work more meaningful for Ben. Maria became like family, treating David as if he were her own lost son. She taught Ben Spanish words so he could understand her lullabies, and she learned English phrases so they could communicate better about David's needs. Her presence brought warmth and laughter back to the cabin that had been so quiet since Martha's death. But Ben knew this arrangement, while working for now, wasn't a permanent solution. Maria was young and would eventually want to marry and have her own family. David would need more as he grew: education, friends, opportunities that their isolated ranch couldn't provide. The questions that had seemed so urgent in the first desperate weeks were still there, just temporarily answered. For now, though, Ben was content to take each day as it came. He had found a way to keep his son, to honor Martha's memory by raising the child they'd created together. David was thriving under the combined care of his devoted father and Maria's maternal skills. As Ben watched his son sleep each night, he felt Martha's presence like a gentle blessing. She would be proud of the way he'd fought to keep their family together, proud of the strong, healthy baby David was becoming. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Ben was no longer facing them alone. 6 months into their arrangement, Maria Santos announced news that sent Ben's carefully constructed world spinning again. She stood in his kitchen, holding David, who had just finished his morning feeding, her dark eyes bright with happiness and apprehension. "Senor Ben, I must tell you something important," she said, switching between English and Spanish in her nervousness. "Roberto Morales, he asked me to marry him. We want to move to San Antonio, where his brother has work in the leather shop." Ben felt the familiar cold fear settle in his stomach. Maria had become essential to their daily survival, but more than that, she'd become David's second mother. The baby adored her, reaching for her each morning with delighted squeals and settling into sleep most easily in her arms. Losing Maria would mean starting over again with all the desperate challenges Ben had thought he'd conquered. "When?" Ben asked, trying to keep his voice steady while reaching for David. The baby was now crawling everywhere and had grown into a sturdy, happy child with Martha's blue eyes and Ben's dark hair. 2 months after harvest time. "Roberto wants to be married before winter." Maria's voice was apologetic but firm. "I'm sorry, Senor Ben. I know this makes things hard for you and little David." Ben nodded, forcing himself to smile. Maria deserved happiness, deserved a husband, and the chance for children of her own. She'd given him and David 6 precious months when they'd needed her most. He couldn't begrudge her this opportunity, even though it felt like losing Martha. All over again, the next few weeks were filled with frantic searching for alternatives. Ben rode to every ranch and farm within a day's journey, asking if anyone knew of a woman who might help care for David. Most of the responses were sympathetic but unhelpful. Single women were rare on the frontier, and those who existed were either too young, too old, or already committed to their own families. Mrs. Patterson suggested he consider moving to town, where there would be more people available to help with childcare. But Ben's small ranch represented everything he'd worked for, everything he'd promised to build for Martha and their future children. Selling it would mean giving up not just his livelihood but his dreams. David seemed to sense the tension in the household. He became fussier than usual, clinging to both Ben and Maria with unusual intensity. The happy, easygoing baby began waking at night with crying spells that nothing seemed to soothe. Ben would walk the floor with him for hours, both of them, exhausted and miserable. 3 weeks before Maria's wedding, Ben was in Austin buying supplies when he overheard a conversation at the general store that changed everything. 2 ladies were discussing a mutual acquaintance who'd recently moved to Texas from back east. "Poor Eleanor Mitchell," one woman was saying, "coming all this way to marry a man she'd never met, only to find out he'd died of fever before she arrived. Now she's stuck here with no money to get home and no family to help her." Ben's ears perked up. A woman alone, needing work and a place to stay, sounded like the answer to his prayers. He approached the ladies politely, hat in hand, and asked if they might introduce him to this Eleanor Mitchell, Mrs. Pemberton. The banker's wife looked him up and down with obvious concern. "Mr. Carter, I'm not sure that would be appropriate. Eleanor is a refined lady from Boston, educated and gently raised. She's hardly suited for ranch life or ... other arrangements." The disapproval in her voice made Ben's face burn, but he pressed on. "Ma'am, I'm not looking for anything improper. I need help caring for my baby son, someone who could be like a governess or housekeeper. I'd pay fair wages and provide separate quarters. It would be completely respectable. Eleanor is staying at the boarding house, but she can't afford it much longer. She's been looking for work as a teacher or a governess, but there aren't many opportunities in Austin. Perhaps you should speak to her directly." Ben found Eleanor Mitchell in the boarding house parlor, mending a dress that had seen better days. She was probably 30 years old, with auburn hair pinned back severely and intelligent green eyes that held a mixture of dignity and desperation. She was plain, but not unattractive, with a kind of composed bearing that suggested inner strength. When Ben explained his situation, Eleanor listened carefully without interrupting. She asked thoughtful questions about David's age, his daily needs, and what exactly Ben expected from someone in her position. Her accent marked her clearly as an educated Easterner, but she didn't seem put off by the rough realities of ranch life he described. "Mr. Carter, I must be honest with you," Eleanor said when he finished. "I came to Texas expecting to marry and settle into a comfortable domestic life. Instead, I find myself alone in a strange place with very few options. Your offer is unconventional, but it would solve problems for both of us." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I should tell you that I've never been married or had children of my own. But I'm willing to learn, and I desperately need respectable employment." Ben felt hope stirring in his chest for the first time in weeks. Eleanor Mitchell seemed intelligent and capable, exactly the kind of person who could help David grow up properly educated. She might not have Maria's natural maternal instincts, but she had something equally valuable, the refinement and learning that could give David advantages Ben couldn't provide alone. They agreed that Eleanor would come to the ranch for a trial period of 1 week before Maria's wedding. If things worked out for both of them, she would stay permanently as David's governess and Ben's housekeeper. The arrangement would be strictly business, with Eleanor having her own room and complete authority over David's education and daily care. When Ben brought Eleanor to the ranch the following Monday, David was initially shy around the strange woman with the different accent and formal manner. Unlike Maria's warm, instinctive approach, Eleanor was more methodical in her interactions with the baby, but Ben could see her genuine effort to connect with him. Maria spent her last week teaching Eleanor everything she'd learned about David's routines, his preferences, and the practical aspects of caring for an active 8-month-old. The language barrier made communication difficult, but both women were determined to ensure David's continued well-being. "She is a good woman," Maria told Ben the night before her wedding. "Different from me, but good for David. He needs to learn reading and writing, proper manners. She can teach him things I never could." Ben nodded, grateful for Maria's blessing, even as he worried about the dramatic change in David's care. Eleanor was clearly intelligent and well-meaning, but would she be able to love his son the way Maria had? Would David accept this formal, reserved woman as a substitute for the warm maternal care he'd known? On Maria's wedding day, Ben stood in the back of the small church with David in his arms, watching the woman who'd saved their family promise herself to another man. Roberto Morales was a good man who'd waited patiently for Maria's commitment to the Carter family to end. As they exchanged vows, Ben whispered a prayer of gratitude for Maria's sacrifice and a plea for blessing on Eleanor's new role in their lives that evening. Eleanor settled David into his crib with the efficient movements of someone still learning the routine. Ben wondered if he was making another terrible mistake. The baby fussed more than usual, clearly missing Maria's familiar touch and voice. Eleanor persevered with patient determination, but Ben could see the strain in her face. Change was never easy, especially for a baby who'd already lost his mother and now his beloved caregiver. But as Ben watched Eleanor read David at bedtime story in her clear, educated voice, he began to hope that this new arrangement might work after all. Eleanor Mitchell's first month at the Carter Ranch was a testament to sheer determination overcoming natural inclination. Unlike Maria's instinctive warmth with children, Eleanor approached caring for David like a complex problem to be solved through careful observation and systematic effort. She kept detailed notes about his eating habits, sleep patterns, developmental milestones, with the precision of a scientist. David, now 10 months old and crawling everywhere with boundless energy, initially resisted Eleanor's more structured approach to childcare, cried when she tried to feed him according to schedule instead of on demand. He clearly missed Maria's spontaneous songs and gentle rocking. But Eleanor persevered with the same quiet strength that had brought her across the country to marry a stranger. Ben watched the adjustment period with growing anxiety. Some evenings he'd find Eleanor in the kitchen after David was asleep, her composed mask slipping to reveal exhaustion and doubt. She never complained, but he could see the strain of caring for an active baby while learning to manage a frontier household. "Am I doing this right?" Eleanor asked one evening as they sat by the fire after a particularly challenging day. David had been teething and fussy, rejecting Eleanor's attempts at comfort while reaching constantly for his father. "I read about child-rearing back in Boston, but books don't prepare you for the reality." Ben looked at this educated woman who'd given up everything to help a stranger raise his child. "You're doing better than I did those first weeks alone. David just needs time to get used to you. He's been through a lot of changes in his short life." Gradually, Eleanor began to find her own way with David. She discovered that he responded well to routine and predictability, calming down when he knew what to expect next. She started each day with the same sequence of activities: breakfast, washing, getting dressed, morning walk around the ranch that gave David security in his new world. Eleanor's teaching background served her well as David grew more alert and curious. She talked to him constantly, describing everything they did and saw, expanding his vocabulary even before he could speak. She read to him from the books she'd brought from Boston. She began teaching him simple songs that helped develop his memory and language skills. But it was Eleanor's gradual transformation that surprised Ben most. The formal, reserved woman who'd arrived at his ranch began to soften under David's innocent influence. Ben would catch her making silly faces to make the baby laugh, or talking to him in the gentle, nonsensical way that came naturally to people who truly cared about children. The breakthrough came during David's first winter at the ranch. He developed a fever and cough that had both Ben and Eleanor worried sick. For 3 days and nights, Eleanor barely left David's side, holding him when he couldn't sleep, coaxing him to drink fluids when he wouldn't eat, and monitoring his temperature with the dedication of a trained nurse. On the third night, when David's fever finally broke and he slept peacefully for the first time in days, Eleanor collapsed in the rocking chair beside his crib. Ben found her there at dawn, still in the clothes she'd worn for 3 days, her hair disheveled and her face pale with exhaustion. "He's going to be fine," Ben said softly, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You saved him, Eleanor. Couldn't have managed this without you." Eleanor looked up at Ben with tears in her eyes. "I was so scared, Ben. Somewhere along the way, he stopped being just a job to me. He became ... mine. I love him like he was born to me." From that moment, David's acceptance of Eleanor was complete. He began reaching for her when he was tired, babbling excitedly when she entered a room, and settling into her arms, with the trust he'd once shown only to Maria and Ben. Eleanor bloomed under this acceptance, her natural maternal instincts finally emerging now that she felt secure in her role. Spring brought new challenges and opportunities. David was walking now, toddling around the ranch with fearless curiosity that kept Eleanor constantly alert. She proved surprisingly capable of adapting to ranch life, learning to manage the household efficiently while keeping David safe and entertained in a potentially dangerous environment. Ben found himself noticing things about Eleanor he'd missed during the difficult adjustment period. She had a quick wit and dry sense of humor that emerged once she felt comfortable. Her education allowed her to discuss books and ideas in ways that reminded Ben of conversations with Martha, though Eleanor's perspective was different and equally engaging. More importantly, Ben began to see how Eleanor's influence was shaping David into the kind of person Martha would have wanted him to become. She taught him manners and kindness, introduced him to music and stories, and encouraged his natural curiosity about the world around him. Under her guidance, David was developing into a bright, well-behaved child who could hold his own in any company. The transformation in their household didn't go unnoticed by neighbors and friends. Mrs. Patterson, who'd worried about Ben's ability to raise David alone, David's advanced development during a routine visit, crediting Eleanor's structured approach to early education, but it was during David's second birthday celebration that Ben fully realized how much their lives had changed. Eleanor had organized a small party with neighboring families, baking a cake and decorating the cabin with wildflowers. David, now a sturdy 2-year-old with his mother's blue eyes and his father's determined chin, charmed everyone with his polite manners and bright conversation. Watching Eleanor help David blow out his candles, Ben felt a profound sense of gratitude mixed with something deeper he was afraid to name. This woman had saved his family in ways he was only beginning to understand. She'd given David not just care and education, but the kind of stable, loving environment every child deserved. That evening, after the guests had gone and David was asleep, Ben and Eleanor sat on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant colors. The comfortable silence between them felt natural now, built on 2 years of shared responsibility and mutual respect. "You ever regret coming here?" Ben asked suddenly, the question that had been weighing on his mind for months. "Giving up your plans for a different life to help raise another woman's child?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer carefully. "I came to Texas expecting to find a husband and a ready-made life," she said finally. "Instead, I found something I didn't know I was looking for: purpose, and a family that chose me rather than being assigned to me by circumstance." She paused, then continued with the honesty that had come to characterize their relationship. "David has given me more joy than I ever expected to find. Watching him grow, teaching him, being needed and loved by him, it's filled a hole in my heart I didn't even know existed." Ben felt his chest tighten with emotion. "He's lucky to have you. Both are. I don't know what would have happened to us without your help." Eleanor turned to look at him, her green eyes serious in the fading light. "We've built something good here, Ben. David has 2 parents who love him, even if we came to be a family in an unconventional way. It's growing up knowing he's wanted and cared for, which is more than many children can say." The word parents hung in the air between them, acknowledging what they'd both been thinking but neither had dared to say. Somewhere in the daily routines of caring for David, the shared worry during his illnesses, the pride in his accomplishments, they'd become more than employer and employee. They'd become partners in the most important work either of them had ever undertaken. As the stars appeared overhead, Ben found himself thinking about the future in ways he hadn't since Martha's death. David would need stability as he grew older. The security of knowing his family wouldn't disappear again. Eleanor had proven her devotion to the boy, but her position in their household remained precarious, technically temporary, dependent on Ben's continued need for her services. The conversation they needed to have was approaching, Ben realized. The question of whether their partnership might become something more permanent, more official. But for now, he was content to sit in comfortable companionship with the woman who'd helped him rebuild his shattered world. Inside the cabin, David slept peacefully in the room Eleanor had made beautiful with her touches: colorful quilts, educational toys, and shelves of books that would help him grow into the educated, thoughtful person both his mothers would have wanted him to become. The cradle Ben had built with such hope and love sat empty now. It's no longer needed but kept as a reminder of how their family had begun. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, as every day did when raising a child. But Ben no longer faced those challenges alone. She'd kept that unspoken promise for 2 years now, and Ben was beginning to hope she might be willing to make it official and permanent. The sound of David stirring in his room brought them both to their feet, parents responding instantly to their child's need. As they walked into the cabin together, Ben felt Martha's presence like a gentle blessing on the family they'd created from love, loss, and the determination to do right by an innocent child who deserved the best they could give him. The conversation Ben had been preparing for came naturally on a warm spring evening 2 months after David's 2nd birthday. Eleanor was reading to David on the front porch while Ben finished his evening chores, a scene that had become as familiar and comforting as sunrise. And he chattered constantly about everything from the colors of flowers to the habits of the ranch animals. When David finally fell asleep, in Eleanor's arms, Ben carried him to his bed while Eleanor prepared their own simple supper. They'd fallen into domestic rhythms that felt as natural as breathing, but Ben knew that without some formal arrangement, their stability remained fragile. "Eleanor," Ben began as they sat down to eat. "I need to ask you something important, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." Eleanor set down her fork, giving him her complete attention. Over 2 years of partnership had taught her to recognize when Ben had something serious on his mind. "David needs security," Ben continued. "He needs to know his family won't disappear again, that the people who love him will be there as he grows up. And I need to know that too." He paused, gathering courage for words he'd never expected to say to anyone after Martha. "What I'm asking is whether you'd consider making this arrangement permanent. Whether you'd marry me, not for romance or passion, to give David the stable family he deserves and to make you truly his mother in the eyes of the law." Eleanor didn't respond immediately, but Ben could see her mind working through the implications of his proposal. She'd given up everything to help raise David, but marriage would mean giving up her independence entirely. "I need you to understand what I'm offering and what I'm not," Ben continued honestly. "But I respect you. I trust you completely with David, and I care about your happiness and well-being. We work well together as partners in raising him." Eleanor nodded slowly. "And you need to understand that I've grown to love David as if he were my own son. Marrying you would make that official, but it wouldn't change how I feel about him. He's already the most important thing in my world." She was quiet for several minutes, staring out at the sunset that painted their small world in golden light. "Ben, when I came to Texas, I was looking for security and respectability through marriage to a stranger. What I found instead was purpose and a child who needed me. If you're offering me the chance to be David's mother legally as well as practically, then yes, I'll marry you." They decided to have a simple ceremony the following month, with just a few close neighbors as witnesses. David was too young to understand the significance, but he seemed to sense the happiness and security that surrounded the preparations of wildflowers from her garden. The day of the wedding, Ben stood at the altar of the small church looking at. She looked beautiful in her simple dress, but more importantly, she looked happy and confident about the choice they were making together. "Do you, Benjamin Carter, take Eleanor Mitchell to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health?" "I do," Ben replied, meaning every word of the promise he was making to this remarkable woman who'd saved his family. When Eleanor repeated her vows, her voice was steady and sure. "I do," she said, and Ben knew she was promising not just to be his wife, but to be David's mother for all the years to come. David participated in the ceremony as their ring-bearer, carefully carrying the simple gold bands Ben had bought in Austin. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, David clapped his hands with delight, making everyone laugh and breaking any remaining tension. The reception was held at their ranch, with neighbors bringing food and staying to celebrate into the evening. David charmed everyone with his polite manners and bright conversation, clearly thriving under the love and attention of his extended community family as the sun set on their wedding day. Ben and Eleanor sat on their front porch watching David play with the wooden horse Ben had carved for him. The little boy was chattering to his toy, creating elaborate stories that showed the imagination Eleanor had been nurturing through books and storytelling. "No regrets?" Ben asked Eleanor, taking her hand for the first time as his wife. Eleanor smiled, watching David with the expression of pure maternal love that had developed over their years together. "None at all. We've built something beautiful here, Ben. David will grow up knowing he's wanted and loved by both his parents." She paused, then added quietly, "I know I can never replace Martha, and I wouldn't want to. She gave David life and gave you the love that made you the father you are today. But I can give David what Martha would have wanted him to have: education, stability, and a mother's love." Ben squeezed her hand, feeling Martha's presence like a gentle blessing on their unconventional but deeply loving family. "She would be grateful for what you've done for him, what you've done for both of us as the years passed." Their marriage grew into something neither of them had expected. Not the passionate romance Ben had shared with Martha, but a deep partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and genuine affection. David thrived under their combined care, growing into a bright, confident boy who excelled in his studies while learning ranch skills from his father. Eleanor proved herself capable of adapting to every challenge frontier life presented. David to read and write, introduced him to music and literature, and helped him develop the social graces that would serve him well in any company. But she also learned to shoot a rifle, to tend injured animals, to manage the practical demands of ranch life. When David started school in town, the other children were fascinated by his stories of ranch life and impressed by his advanced reading skills. His teachers noted his unusual maturity and thoughtfulness, qualities that reflected the stable, loving environment Eleanor and Ben had created for him. On David's 5th birthday, as they celebrated with neighbors and friends, Ben looked around at their gathered community and felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought them all together. His son was healthy, happy, and surrounded by people who loved him. Eleanor had become not just David's mother, but Ben's true partner in every aspect of their life together. That night, after David was asleep and the guests had gone home, Ben and Eleanor sat in their parlor reading quietly together, a scene of domestic contentment that Martha would have recognized and approved. The cowboy who had once wept by his baby's cradle, overwhelmed by the impossibility of raising a child alone, had found his way to happiness through the love and sacrifice of a woman who'd whispered, through her actions if not her words, that he would never have to face parenthood alone again.